This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website. Okay, it says recording now. It's so cold. Oh, freezing. The topic for today, I realise that you guys will have probably had a fair bit of exposure to it previously, but it's still important to cover off to make sure that no stone unturned, and hey, you might be able to teach me something in the process. Anyway, so apologies for taking it back. It never fails to amaze me how people, architects who design lecture theatres, you never think they'd been to a lecture themselves. Because why would you put doors at the back so people have to trape across? They should be at the back, shouldn't they? So you can happily come in and go as you want to without interrupting things. And usually there's a clock over here so that you can see it and I can't necessarily. Okay, now we're all here. Anybody else to come? No? We'll start? Sweet, okay. So it's just a bit of a run over stuff that you already know. I'm pretty sure. Just tell me if if it's too simple for you and we'll go quicker. Shouldn't take too long anyway, this one. So basically, biopotentials originate, as you probably know, at the cell membrane. Excuse me. And you guys at this stage would know quite well about cell physiology, structure of cells, yes? That you can regard them, as it's been glibly put here, a bunch of genetic material in a biochemical factory in a bag. So the genetic material is in the nucleolus, and around that is a membrane around the very outside. It's basically to separate two water environments from each other so that there's the extracellular milieu, primordially salt water, to keep it separate from our internal water. So sodium chloride solution outside and likewise inside with the cytosol. And as well as that cytosol, there's cytoplasm, which means there are the various organelles and the structures and so on. And you've heard all this before, I'm sure, probably several times over. Yeah? Okay. So we can probably take that as read. And you're probably also well aware where biopotentials actually come from. Yeah? So tell me about it. Anybody? Where do you think biopotentials come from? Yeah, it's a cell membrane potential, particularly when the cell membrane is stimulated in some way. It will respond with what we call an action potential, and you've heard that term. Yeah. So we can define a resting state, and once stimulated by various forms of energy, mechanical, electrical, chemical. What else we got? Yeah, electrical for sure. Chemical, magnetic. I think I mentioned that maybe twice, but we can mention it again because there'll be various different forms of mechanical energy, yes. What else we got? So thermal, yeah. So thermal, don't know whether that actually will stimulate an action potential, but it sure as hell makes a big difference to an action potential, as we'll see. Radiant, yeah, well, you know, he's looking at, yeah. Yeah. That's certainly a cell stimulation. What have we forgotten? I always forget one out of the 6. Yeah, okay, so certain birds apparently respond to magnetic stimulus. Yeah, it's part of the navigation, and it's somewhat unilateral for birds, some birds. I don't know the detail of that at all. Okay, so we can isolate 2 states, the resting state, where nothing's really happening, and the activated state after stimulation. Okay, so the cell membrane itself is usually explained as, and this is a sheet form, so, oops, imagine that's actually a wraparound into a spherical arrangement, but I'm going the wrong way. Come on, back. So these 2 sheets here, excuse me, 2 layers of phospholipid, and being lipid fat, we can imagine that that's pretty much an insulating material, generally speaking. And when you've got 2 layers like this that happily join together because they've got a water-seeking tail and a water-fearing tail, and so the water-fearing tails can push in towards each other and happily mesh in a mutually agreeable state where they can keep water out on one side and, on both sides, one below each of these layers, and in between there's kind of like an insulating material. So once again we've got a notional capacitance. Yeah. So you can imagine the top to be the plate of a capacitor and the bottom to be the plate of another capacitor, with cholesterol type material in between, intermingling there, and the structure is sort of happily sits into position, keeping water out on one side and water in on the other, with the possibility of some gateways, as shown here, by way of the proteins which act as receptors for various molecules, and in fact can form channels that allow or do not allow at certain strategic times inflow and outflow of ion fluxes. And there's also the integral proteins here that stabilise the whole assembly so it doesn't slide apart. Okay. You've seen this before, I'm guessing? Too often? Yeah, alright. There may be some who haven't, that's why I feel duty bound to brush over it at least. This one didn't get into your the handout that I put on LMS, but it's just something that I was planning to put in there. A good reference for you is this Rangoyan biomedical signal analysis, and he's drawn here a couple of scenarios for that. But I won't go into it too much here, except to say that the important ions, as you know, are sodium and potassium, and calcium and chloride. And we'll see the movement of these generally. So, because we have this insulating material, and that's also mechanically isolating, then we can get the occurrence of, under the steady state condition, an abundance of sodium internally, sorry, sodium externally and potassium internally, and it sets up a charge balance across the membrane structure, positive outside, and usually we say internal, negative internally. As I mentioned before, there's the occurrence of those ion channels that really are the major aspect of how these things work, that selectively under certain circumstances permit the influx and outflux of sodium and potassium for the most part, and also the chloride ion as well. There are also the passive channels that allow normal ongoing infusion of those elements, and so there's a steady leak, if you will, and there's also the occurrence of active transport across the cell membrane. So, we've got, under normal circumstances, a higher concentration of sodium outside than inside, and a higher concentration of potassium inside compared to outside. And they want to equalise if they can, because there will be an electric field for those ions, and they'll be attracted by those fields. We get some, similar to the semiconductors, we're going to get drift by way of that electric field and diffusion against it in the other direction. I mentioned the active pump that's perpetually trying to equalise roughly equal amounts of sodium being pushed out to potassium being pushed in, and the whole thing basically looks like a battery for either ion. We've got this potential across the membrane. Okay, under normal resting circumstances, the major players, the sodium and potassium, are in an equilibrium balance, along with the chloride, which doesn't really get much of a mention, but it turns out that it's quite useful. And in some tissues, some cell lines, calcium is extremely important as well, as you're also probably well aware. And you'll be familiar with the Nernst equation at this stage, yes? Most of you? Nernst equation? No? Yes? That's a yes? I'm seeing some doubt here. It's, okay. All right, the Nernst equation bears a lot of similarity to some of the stuff I've been trying to teach in semiconductors. So it turns out that it's a function of concentrations, a ratio of concentrations, for which we take the log and we multiply by this monstrosity here, which turns out to be very similar to the volt equivalent of temperature, because basically it's a relationship that's a balancing between drift and diffusion. That's why it crops up here as it does in semiconductors. In semiconductors we had a variable called VT, yes? Do you remember that? Volt equivalent of temperature? Well, this is basically the same relationship, Einstein's relationship, and with the caveat that for certain ions we have to include this fudge factor in here for the valence. Okay, since you know all this stuff, and you know that at 37 degrees body temperature, that VT thing, if I can call it, is going to be 27.6 millivolts. Yeah. For our circuit theory applications, we called it 25, didn't we? Yeah? 25 millivolts for a certain temperature. Do you recall that? KT on Q, VT. Yes? Okay, so you would then be able to confirm for each one of these ionic species a value predicted by the Nernst equation. Can you do it now? For starters, you won't have to worry about the permeability. We'll come to that in a minute. Can you utilise the Nernst equation with those values for internal and external concentrations? And I guess first up, how am I going to prove that RT on NF for a monovalent ion is equal to 27.6 millivolts? How will I prove that? What's the formula? Do you know enough? Do you know enough of these things to be able to work that out? Or can you just draw on Vt equals to a certain number proportional to temperature? Apologies for the red. Apologies to the viewers at home. What was it? T in kelvins. Do you remember I gave you this one as a aide-memoire? Yep. So that's the same as saying KT on Q. So we got normal body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius, and in kelvins that'll be you can't do maths. Okay. Yep. That's not 1,000, that's kelvins. By the way, we use a lowercase k for kilo, don't we? For that reason, or one of those reasons. Mm-hmm. Boltzmann's constant. That annoying little k that's just contradicted what I said about little k for kilo. Yes? Is that right? Boltzmann's constant, joules per Kelvin, I think, and electronic charge. Coulombs. Agreed? Yes? So are we satisfied that we can work out for Vt being 27.6? Someone check that? That's millivolts? And if your calculator doesn't do natural logs, but does log to the base 10, then this is the, using the change of base rule, we can change over to this factor 61.5. Good. Enough justifications then? So how did we go with under exam conditions, how long would it take you to work out the nerd's potential for 20 minutes? Okay. The time starts now. So you won't have to worry about the permeability at the moment because it's going to be the same for internal and external for each species, but when you mix the species, that's when the permeability becomes important. Yeah. My mistake. It's been pointed out that I'm dyslexic. I should have written 26.7 there. You're quite right. Thank you very much for that. I bet that's not the only mistake I make today. It's going to be one of those days. You can just tell. That's why I wanted you guys to work through this, so you could correct my mistakes and tell me about it. It works out to be the same. They're not the same thing. So if you've gone to the trouble of working through those now, have you had time enough? It's about 20 minutes overall means about 6 minutes to do each of these, right? Okay, so if it were just a single iron species, then these would be the values that you might see. And notice I got it right here. Thankfully. It was just a typographic error earlier. Watch the one on the chloride down here. This is interesting. Simply because if we put them all together, we have the so-called Goldman equation that deals with all iron species simultaneously. And I'm guessing you would have done a calculation like this previously as well, yes? Unless you did the medical subject, in which case you just put the words together. Correct? Anybody done this equation before? Yep, good, thanks for that. Sorry to bore you with it then. This is when we need to introduce the permeability constants because it's different for the different iron species. And because because we don't have the possibility of, well, we don't have obvious cancellation that we had before. I mean, if we can revert this back to a Nernst equation just by thinking of one species alone. And if that's the case, then the permeability constants for the individual ion species that we retain cancels out. That's why it reverts back to Nernst again. However, when we have the three major players all working together, we need to introduce their permeability constants to each concentration here. So would you be so kind as to add that permeability coefficient to your calculation? Indulge me, please. Because I think the result is interesting. And you're probably aware of it, but I'd like to make a point on it once you've done it. I think it's wise to revise because you never know when you might come across this in the next month or so. If they're needed, yeah, of course.
We have to memorize Boltzmann constant and stuff, or do you like this?
You know it?
I do actually, but only all.
Hey, I keep coming back to this. I mean, that's the one I found easy to remember, and it's almost exact, not quite. You see, when I was in first year, I could remember I think I told you, I could remember Boltzmann's constant or the electron charge, but never both at the one time. But if I could remember that, I could work out the other one quite easily, yeah. So now, in a circumstance like that, we give you these values, but as a reality check, you can always fall back on 11.600.
That's a good point.
I don't think it's in this room of the RT right now.
Well,
In
look,
this instance.
it wouldn't help you here because there's obviously got to be some embellishments to that equation if you've got polyproline on species there. I don't know the answer to that. But I'll try and find out. Does anybody know that?
The question is, we don't have an N here. Do we have to moderate that to make the Goldman equation work for polyvalent ion species if they are to be included? Who's the chemist here? Well, the problem is that in muscle and cardiac muscle, calcium is a big player. So therefore, we need to know the answer to that question.
I thought you were calling one species, not comparing multiple species. We should have potassium plus and potassium 2 plus.
No, I mean if we were to introduce calcium to this equation.
The Nernst equation, you know, take into account the permeability of the membrane to the specific ion, but in this equation you do.
Correct. Yeah.
Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Well, in the Nernst equation, you would the permeability is cancelled.
Oh, yeah.
So what I'm saying is if you squash those two,
Yeah.
then you can't necessarily do it. Do we have a chemist on board here? Who could let me look at it? Well, if we have calcium, then calcium would have to have an N value, it's N of 2 for the Nernst equation. Therefore, what do we do with the Goldman equation if we introduce calcium to it? And then we'll just avoid that. We won't drink milk, it won't be a problem. All right. Has anyone got an answer for this yet? Yeah. Has anyone got a value for it here? Just as it stands. Oh, 71? 71 millivolts. Is that what? 71.8. Thank you. I'm offered 71.8 for the answer for this. Anybody got any adjustment to that? 71.8? Maybe 71.8? Yeah? Anything you say, you're right. Okay. Now, isn't it remarkable that that is same value as the chloride, the individual chloride Nernst equation prediction? So it's as if to say these bits here don't really matter that much. Well, they probably do, but mostly it's the chloride ion that's the indicator of the resting potential. And the chloride doesn't really make a big noise in this voltage business. How about that? Because everybody's more interested in sodium. Under stimulation, we get an inrush of sodium from outside. Happens first. Sodium permeability increases, and that's followed by an outpouring of potassium, which you're familiar with, yes? And it's because of those differences that we get this compound action potential where the membrane that was previously polarised becomes depolarised. So from what we had before, 71 millivolts to approximately, 40 or something millivolts, depolarised. Thereafter, things slowly revert back. Sodium gets its act together more quickly, potassium lags a bit, and we end up with repolarisation, or in fact an overshoot to hyperpolarisation. Now this is a slide from the ill-fated textbook that I tried to introduce, the Web 1. You'd be pleased to know that the publishers actually delivered one to me now, finally, after a semester. Yeah? Nothing if not responsive. I think they know that there's a lot of mistakes in the book, so they're probably not pushing it too hard. Anyway, nerve cell depicted here with its cell body nucleus, its axon and its terminals, and the dendrites over here on the cell body end. And we would have another connection to other nerve cells down the bottom, similar packages. Okay, so that's one type of excitable tissue, the nerve cell. The other one is obviously muscle and cardiac tissue. So we've got this resting state situation and active state, and the stimulus has to be of a certain level in order for an action potential to evolve. We have, that's the so-called all or none action potential threshold. Here we have the depiction. This is from the book by Webster, Bioinstrumentation, with a cartoon form of the polarised state with the ion channels effectively closed, mostly closed with a little bit of leakage, and sodium is kept from penetrating in, and potassium is held within the cell until the stimulus, in which case the ion channels open up, sodium can flood in, potassium still held bound for a little while until such time as the potassium channels open up and we get outflow of potassium, and the sodium is once again blocked, and the status of the membrane is coming back to being polarised, or it can undershoot if more potassium goes out than was originally, undershoot or hyperpolarised. Okay, so that's the pictorial cartoon form there, showing the stages in the action potential in a very rough manner. As I said before, the situation changes for cardiac or muscle tissue and cardiac tissue where calcium gets in on the act. And in that circumstance, with the arrangement of the connections not being synaptic as they were here, as I was talking about here, the connections between neurons are chemical ones, chemical synapses, where there's a neurotransmitter evolved at the axon terminae here, and they are picked up by the dendrites of other nerve cells. With muscle and cardiac cells, it's an electrical conduction pathway, and whether it be via a motor neuron releasing calcium in abundance to as a reply to the sodium outflow, but we get a very extensive blocking plateau here in the case of particularly cardiac and to some extent muscle tissue as well. Different morphology of the action potential. For some reason I missed out mentioning the refractory periods. I'm not seeing them here. Okay, I'll keep going because I think they show up here. Oh yes, absolute refractory period means that no matter what a restimulus strength is, it won't be acknowledged unless a certain period has elapsed. That is the absolute refractory period. There is a relatively refractory period after that where a stimulated cell that's given an action potential will respond if a new stimulus is larger. So that's particularly important for cardiac cells as they pass the stimulus from cell to cell to make sure that there is no re-triggering, if I can use that term in electronic form, as an electronic analogy. Don't intend to, we're running out of time here, so I won't labour the point about that. We might have an opportunity to talk about it this afternoon, but basically this is a depiction of a pacemaker cell, which is more like a neuron type action potential, but calcium being one of the major players here, compared to ventricular cells, which have that lockout kind of feature to them. Webster also shows the ionic currents as conductances in sodium and potassium form, and here's the discussion of the refractory periods. So, an overall model that's often used in electrical sort of depiction of cell membranes with the ionic flows is shown here. Ionic currents that vary depending on the state of the action potential at the time, and the boundaries are often just shown as resistive between two different points, internally and externally, and there's obviously a capacitance as discussed before because of that fatty nature of the phospholipids that it constitutes from. All right, some references there, and I'll see if I can answer any questions if there are any. We needed a chemist here, I think. We'll see if I can find one for this afternoon. Yep. I think Igor and Jack were working on getting a classroom for next Friday, was it? For a revision session, because I owe you a lecture. Anybody know how that's developing? What else do we have to discuss? We need to figure out the arrangements for submission of workshop 4, formally due tomorrow, but you'd find it difficult if there's no portal to submit it in. So I'll set that up tomorrow for those who are ready to go. Anyone who's needing a little bit more time, I think that's perfectly reasonable. Who's finished the workshop session now? Anybody finished completely? Fill in the student evaluation form on your mobile. They really want you to do it here. I want you to do it too, if you wouldn't mind, please. I think it closes on June the 9th. So I'll see you at 3:15, yes? He's formally tomorrow. Formally.
I was going to just use it. Yeah, just use that one. Yeah. You don't have the phone. Use big. Thanks.
Sorry.
Thank you. No, you're right.
Sorry? For some people, are not sponsored by Stan's more into
First word. Yeah. Where is it?
Yeah, but it'd still be some. Seem to be a secret give it in muscle.
I think what I was trying to say is that it doesn't apply in one of the assumptions for the transpiration. So it doesn't apply in the weight calcium. Right, they're doing that harm.
Thanks. I bet you guys are excited to listen to the tire. I was thinking about ways about how can I finish this and then like sneak out. But you can only get out from the front.
Yeah.
That's so annoying.